So in this module, we'll take a look at virtual machines, networks, and storage, just to get an idea how those three particular items work in Azure. You know, if you're an IT pro and getting introduced to Azure administration, you know, these are probably the three things you think most often of when you think about cloud computing and how I translate my infrastructure to cloud computing. You know, most administrators manage networks, VMs, and storage. So let's take a look at how those items translate into Azure. So within Azure, we have what are called Azure virtual machines. And these are very, very similar to the virtual machine that you would run on Hyper-V. In fact, you can take the virtual hard drives from a Hyper-V virtual machine and you can move them to Azure and vice versa. There's some work you've got to do to, you know, get them ready for transport, but for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward process. It allows you to run them only when you need them. The big difference between an Azure virtual machine and, for example, a Hyper-V virtual machine is with Azure VMs, you only pay for them when they're running. You only pay when they're running. So it's very economical, very simple, very easy to scale up and scale down. You can use a number of types of VMs, not just Windows VMs, also Linux VMs. The size of the VM is what's going to determine how many disks, how much network, how much memory, and the overall performance. So things like the total number of CPUs. You choose the size of the virtual machine, and that gives you a set number. For example, a small virtual machine might be 1 CPU, 4 gigs of RAM, and 2 disks. Whereas a large virtual machine might be 16 disks, 32 cores, 32 CPUs, and maybe 128 gigs of memory. Within Azure, you can change the size of the virtual machine at any time. So for example, we talk about, you know, the ability to scale up and scale down. I can begin, you know, if I go back to my accounting example, I can begin the year on a small virtual machine, and then when tax season comes around and my applications are very busy, go to a larger size virtual machine to scale up my capacity. You pay only for what you use, typically down to the minute. And then finally, you can have resiliency within virtual machines. If there's a hardware failure, it's automatically moved to a new location that's healthy and ready to go. And you can also establish clusters of virtual machines with fault tolerance. So if one goes down, the other one stays online. Obviously, another critical component is a network. So in addition to the virtual machines, we have an Azure network. An Azure network is a representation of a physical network that you might have. If we take a look at this slide right here, we can see that I have, for example, my overall Azure infrastructure. Within my Azure infrastructure, I can mirror my physical infrastructure, such as my subnets. So maybe this is a, you know, a 10.0.0.0 network, and I've got two subnets, 10.0.1.0 and 10.0.2.0. Or maybe my two subnets, and I apologize, my writing wasn't that great on that one. But they represent my physical infrastructure, so I have both a front end and a back end. And you can use this for a couple of different reasons. For example, let's say that you want to pick your data center up. You want to close your physical data center. You want to pick it up and just drop it right in Azure. By creating virtual networks and virtual subnets, you don't need to change your underlying configuration. Your domain controllers can have the same IP address they had on your local hardware as they have in Azure. Your servers can have the same IP addresses. All your scripts and your routing can all work in Azure just as it did on your local data center. You can also choose to do this for security reasons or management. Between subnets, you can implement filtering rules to say that only certain ports or protocols are allowed to go from one subnet to another. And so by breaking it up, you get that flexibility and you get that capability. Some of the benefits of Azure Virtual Networks: they are isolated from each other. They are not physically connected. They are connected via logical virtual networks. All have access to the public internet. You can implement network security groups and gateways to control access, or you can rely on Azure to control access. You don't have to worry about DNS. Azure provides basic name resolution services. So by putting a VM on a virtual network in Azure, DNS is automatic. Now you can still put your own DNS in there, or you can leverage Azure DNS, or you can even point it at a DNS in your own data center, but you don't have to. Azure provides DNS services for you. You have a full set of rules. You don't need to get into, for example, router and switch configuration to filter traffic. You can do it right there in the Azure portal, implement the same kinds of rules that you would have normally done on a switch or a router there via the web portal. And then you can connect your own network to the Azure network via VPNs. Now, VPNs are not the only option. There's something called ExpressRoute, which we'll talk about in a later module. And there's also ways of connecting two VNets in two different regions. And also, you can VPN directly into your Azure network. So there's a number of connection options available. The final piece is storage. So, where do my disks come from in Azure? Well, in Azure, it's a little bit different. You still have the notion of storage, but you have what's called an Azure storage account. Within the Azure storage account, you can create 4 basic things: blobs, queues, tables, and file services. Now, it's important to understand the difference. And the first question that a new Azure administrator often asks is, well, what's a blob? Blob stands for binary large object. In other words, it's a catch-all. You can throw anything in a blob, and as long as the thing that's accessing it understands what it is, you're fine. Queues store messages that are being passed through applications. Tables is a very rudimentary style of database. In fact, calling it a database is probably a bad thing to do. It's a very rudimentary table-focused data store. So if all you need to do is store name, address, phone number, you can use an Azure storage table to do that versus getting into an Azure database. And then file services allow you to create a file share. So if you have servers that are running in Azure, you don't need to create a file server just to store files. You can create a storage account with a file services entry in the storage account. And it emulates a standard Windows SMB file server. Only you, the account owner, can access the data. You can govern permission. And there are 2 types of storage: standard storage and premium storage. We'll talk more about premium storage in a little bit. Standard storage is what most things are stored on. Premium storage is where virtual machines store their VHD files. So what you'll find on there are the VHD files that are used by virtual machines. So we talked about blob containers and what they are. All blobs must be inside a container. And a container you can loosely think of as a directory or as a folder. When you create a storage account, you want to put files in that storage account, you create a container. And within the container, you create blobs. And within the blob, you can now store things like VHD files. And we mentioned premium storage. Premium storage is only available for virtual machines. Very high bandwidth, very low latency. This is the best storage hardware that's available within Azure. Up to 32 terabytes per VM, up to 64,000 IOPS per VM, and 50,000 IOPS per disk with incredibly low storage latency. Now, if you're running a VM, obviously, you don't want storage to be an issue, especially performance, and so that's what premium storage is. You pay a little more for it, and only certain types of virtual machines make premium storage available. And as you're building and configuring your VMs, and we'll see this in other courses, when you choose the VM size, it will indicate whether or not that's on premium storage. And if this particular VM, if disk I/O is going to be a consideration, for example, it's a database VM, you obviously would want to go with premium storage. So that's a quick look at networking, storage, and virtual machines, just as a quick introduction for Azure.